The West has been lost. We've been conquered by communists. There's no point in civic action. There's nothing to do now but to give up, resign ourselves to our fate that we will soon be helpless prisoners in the Gulag. There is no hope. Does that sound familiar? You go to the Gulag and there's no hope, nothing at all that you can do? Well, don't tell that to Vladimir Bukovsky, a Russian that actually was in the Soviet Gulags under communism and still found a way to grind the system down to a halt. So I want to direct you to a blog post that was highlighted on Vox Populi by a guy named Gary North, entitled How to Bring Down the System. Not just a system, but any system. This is a great post. I'll link to it. I suggest you read the whole thing. But Gary argues that any system can be brought down, and the reason for this is universal. First, every institution assumes voluntary compliance in at least 95% of all cases. And we talked about this with the decimation in the Roman legions. About 10% non-compliance is the most an institution seems to be able to handle without coming apart at the seams. Second, every institution has more rules than it can follow, let alone enforce. Some of these rules are self-contradictory. The more rules, the larger the number of contradictions. Third, every institution is built on the assumption of partial compliance. Not everyone will comply with any given procedural rule. There are negative sanctions or punishments to enforce compliance on the few who resist. They serve as examples to force compliance. Conversely, very few people under the institution's jurisdiction will attempt to force the institution to comply exactly with any procedural rule. These three laws of institutions, and they are laws, offer any resistance movement an opportunity to shut down the system. And keep this in mind, we've been talking a lot about Gene Sharp's Dictatorship to Democracy, that institutions are not monolithic. They're full of individual people up and down the hierarchical chain. It appears like this unassailable structure that just presses down on you, but as you get closer and engage with it, you see that any hierarchy is just made up of a bunch of individuals, and they have their weaknesses. So Gary North here writes this under the subtitle Jamming the Gulag. When we think of institutional tyrannies, few come close to matching the system of concentration camps in the Soviet Union, the Gulag. They operated from 1918 until after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. In his book, and I'm starting to read this too, it's very interesting. It's called To Build a Castle by Vladimir Bukovsky. It provides one of the finest descriptions of institution jamming ever recorded. He's the one that organized it. Bukovsky spent well over a decade in the Soviet Gulag during the 1960s and 1970s, and once in prison, he learned how to make life miserable for the director of his camp. He learned this: written complaints had to be responded to officially within a month. This administrative rule governing the camps was for Western consumption, but it was nevertheless the rule. Any camp administrator who failed to honor it risked the possibility of punishment should a superior or ambitious subordinate decide to pressure him for any reason. In short, any failure to do it by the book could be used against him later on. Bukovsky became an assembly line producer of official protest. By the end of his career, he had taught hundreds of other inmates to follow his lead. By following certain procedures that were specified by the complaint system, Bukovsky's protesting army began to disrupt the whole Soviet bureaucracy. His camp clogged the entire system with protests, hundreds of them per day. He estimates that eventually the number of formal complaints exceeded 75,000. He organized protesters and adopted a division of labor. Bukovsky describes the process. At the height of our war, each of us wrote from 10 to 30 complaints a day. Composing 30 complaints in one day is not easy, so we usually divided up the subjects among ourselves, and each man wrote on his own subject before handing it around for copying by all the others. If there are 5 men in a cell, each man takes 6 subjects. Each of them has the chance to write 30 complaints, while composing only 6 himself. And I'll add, he describes how they had to write their complaints on like scraps of paper or bits of toilet paper. They had to smuggle pencil lead into their mouths sometimes to hide it from searches. Like, you guys, we speak English. This guy spent days and nights learning English. We have paper, we have the internet, we have so many resources. This is not a time to give up. The complaints were addressed to prominent individuals and organizations, the deputies of the Supreme Soviet, the regional directors, astronauts, actors, generals, admirals, the secretaries of the Central Committee, the shepherds, sportsmen, and so forth. In the Soviet Union, all well-known individuals are state functionaries, and we see that now, Hollywood, actors, athletes. This is basically all under the control of the globalist superstate. Each complaint had to be responded to. The camp administrators grew frantic. They threatened punishments and often imposed them, but it did no good. The ocean of protests grew. Bukovsky's description is incomparable. The next thing that happens is that the prison office, inundated with complaints, is unable to dispatch them within the 3-day deadline. For overrunning the deadline, they are bound to be reprimanded and to lose any bonuses they might have won. When our war was at its hottest, the prison governor summoned every last employee to help out at the office with his work librarians, bookkeepers, censors, political instructors, and security officers. It went even further. All the students at the next door ministry of the Interior Training College were pressed into helping out as well. All the answers to and dispatches of complaints have to be registered in a special book. Strict attention has to be paid to observing the correct deadlines, since complaints follow a complex route and have to be registered every step of the way. They spawn dossiers and records of their own. In the end, they all land in one of 2 places: the local prosecutor's office or the local department of the Interior Ministry. These offices can't keep up with the flood either, and also break their deadlines, for which they too are reprimanded and lose their bonuses. The bureaucratic machine is thus obliged to work at full stretch, and you transfer the paper avalanche from one office to another, sowing panic in the ranks of the enemy. Bureaucrats are bureaucrats, always at loggerheads with one another, and often enough your complaints become weapons in the internecine wars between bureaucrat and bureaucrat, department and department. This goes on for months and months until, at last, the most powerful factor of all in Soviet life enters into the fray: statistics. Once those 75,000 complaints became part of the statistical record, the records of the bureaucrats and their camps was spoiled. They lost their prizes and their benefits. The workers start seething with discontent. There is panic in the regional party headquarters, and a senior commission of inquiry is dispatched to the prison. The commission then discovered a mass of shortcomings with the work of the prison's administration, although the commission would seldom aid specific prisoners, and the prisoners knew this in advance. But the flood of protests continued for 2 years. The entire bureaucratic system of the Soviet Union found itself drawn into this war. There was virtually no government department or institution, no region or republic from which we weren't getting answers. Eventually, we had drawn the criminal cons into our game, and the complaints disease began to spread throughout the prison, in which there were 1,200 men altogether. 1,200 men brought down the bureaucratic system, the so-called great leftist communist utopia. Bukovsky continues, I think that if the business had continued a little longer and involved everyone in the prison, the Soviet bureaucratic machine would have simply ground to a halt. All Soviet institutions would have had to stop work and busy themselves with writing replies to us. In 1977, they capitulated to several specific demands of the prisoners, improved the conditions of the camps. The governor of that prison was removed and pensioned off. Their ability to inflict death-producing punishments did them little good once the prisoners learned of the Achilles heel of the bureaucracy: paperwork. The leaders of the Soviet Union could bear it no longer. They deported Bukovsky. And I'd encourage you to read the rest of this blog post. He goes on, he talks about Alinsky and James O'Keefe and the bubblegum revolution. But look how it started. It should be a familiar theme if you've been reading Dictatorship to Democracy. It's an idea we're just beginning to familiarize ourselves with in the West, and it's non-compliance. And this idea, where do the authorities get their power? Bukovsky writes, "We had grasped the great truth that it was not rifles, not tanks, and not atom bombs that created power, nor upon them that power rested. Power depended upon public obedience, upon a willingness to submit. Therefore, each individual who refused to submit to force reduced that force by 1/250,000,000th of its sum. We had been schooled by our participation in the civil rights movement. We had received an excellent education in the camps, and we knew of the implacable force of one man's refusal to submit. The authorities knew it too. They had long since abandoned any idea of basing their calculations on communist dogma. They no longer demanded of people a belief in the radiant future. All they needed was submission." But of course, it wasn't just this non-compliance that they discovered that worked so well. It was also active measures, the act of writing these complaints that the bureaucratic system had to respond to, and then flooding the bureaucracy with more and more complaints. And he discusses the result of all this. He says, "The most important result of all was that our prison bosses now feared us. And when the new prison governor made an attempt to restrict our book privileges again, it took only a handful of days on hunger strike to make him give in. After that, they didn't dare lift a finger to us." The prisoners in the Gulag, as a part of the Soviet system, became more powerful than the prison guards, and it didn't take that many of them. So we've learned non-compliance. Non-compliance is a powerful force, but there's also the active measures. In the case of the Soviet system, it was the active measures of writing continuous complaints. So what about our own experience with an attempt at authoritarian takeover? Well, I'm not sure exactly what the Achilles heel is, and I don't think anyone's quite stumbled on it yet, but it is my belief, at least potentially, it could be information. It's an information war. That's why you have the bannings, that's why you have the shadow bans and the removal of personalities offline and authoritative sources and all of that. I think that our own experience with authoritarianism relies on the dissemination of information. And so it's a race to get true information out to the public. Well, what can we do? Well, we can flood the system, the internet, with truth. People working day and night, sharing links, creating content, pushing it out there to delegitimize the institutions that they need to push down their false narratives, their version of reality, which is just completely invented and created, versus the truth. And so I think in a very real way, you, me, we are all participating in this by sharing true information. So is there still hope? Well, of course there's still hope. There was still hope for Soviet prisoners in the Gulag, and they had the ability through coordinated and determined action to bring a bureaucracy to its knees. So if you look at the institution of fake news, there's only so many people willing to serve it. There's only so many personalities that can do the job, that are in those positions, that are within the circle of trust of government officials. There's only so many of them. And there's tens of thousands of people attempting to push truth out there day and night. We don't know how much effort is required to topple the regime of false information. We don't know how much work it will take or how many days, weeks, months, or years. But you do know this. By following the formulas laid out by guys like Bukovsky and Gene Sharp, any system can be brought down.
1973. ABC's Rex Ellis has details of the exchange.
Zurich Airport was the switching point in a deal that took 6 weeks to organize. During that time, the United States played a communications role, helping the Swiss to ensure a smooth operation. The Soviet airliner carrying Vladimir Bukovsky was already on the ground when Louis Corvalan arrived from Chile on a German commercial flight. With Bukovsky on the plane were his mother, his sister, and a 12-year-old nephew who is critically ill with cancer. Bukovsky's relatives have been granted 1 year outside Russia to get medical treatment for the boy. Bukovsky was taken straight from prison to a small airport outside Moscow and did not know he was flying to Zurich until his handcuffs were taken off on the plane. Details of the actual exchange were kept totally secret, and no one except those actually involved knew precisely when it took place. The whole operation took 43 minutes. Bukovsky looked pale and tired, the result of spending half his life in Soviet prisons and psychiatric hospitals.
How did you spend your last days in Moscow?
Moscow in prison.
Soviet dissidents in Europe say the Russians agreed to the exchange because of efforts by dissidents inside the Soviet Union, coupled with heavy pressure from the West. Dissident leaders say Bukovsky's ride to freedom cannot be overemphasized because he is the acknowledged leader of the Soviet dissident movement. Rex Ellis, ABC News.